A quiet morning turns into chaos when a dog races toward a police officer with a note tied to his collar. The message is simple but terrifying. Pipeline leak. Evacuate now before it's too late. Within moments, the officer locks down the entire street, leaving the neighborhood in panic. But as emergency crews search for answers, a darker truth begins to surface. One that could put the whole city at risk. Who wrote the note? How did the dog know? And what secrets will be uncovered before it's too late? This gripping story will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last second. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun cast long shadows across Eleanor Meyer's carefully tended garden, painting her roses in soft golden light. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the sweet perfume of her prized flowers. Eleanor's weathered hands moved with practiced care as she trimmed away dead leaves, her gardening shears making satisfying snips. "You know, Jake," she said softly to the collie lounging nearby, "Bill would have loved to see how the peace roses turned out this year." Her voice held a gentle warmth as she spoke of her late husband. Jake's tail thumped against the grass in response, his brown eyes watching her attentively. The garden had become Eleanor's sanctuary since Bill's passing. Each bloom reminded her of the love they'd shared, each careful pruning away to keep his memory alive. "He always said I had a way with flowers," she continued, brushing a silver strand of hair from her face. "Remember how he used to bring me coffee while I worked out here?" Birds chirped cheerfully in the maple tree overhead, their morning songs mixing with the distant hum of lawnmowers and children's laughter. Eleanor breathed in deeply, savoring the peaceful moment. Her neighborhood was the kind where everyone knew each other, where front porches still hosted evening conversations and children played freely in their yards. Jake suddenly lifted his head, his ears perking forward. His whole body tensed, alert to something Eleanor couldn't perceive. "What is it, you curious troublemaker?" Eleanor chuckled, setting down her shears. But her smile faded as Jake sprang to his feet, his tail straight and rigid. Before she could grab his collar, he bolted down the sidewalk, moving faster than she'd seen him move in years. "Jake, come back!" Eleanor called out, her heart jumping into her throat. She dropped her gardening gloves and ran after him, her comfortable shoes slapping against the concrete. But Jake was too quick, his sleek form disappearing around the corner at the end of the block. "Oh, please come back," she whispered, her breath coming in short gasps as she slowed to a stop. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood there, scanning the empty street. The peaceful morning had suddenly turned tense with worry. Minutes that felt like hours ticked by. Then, just as Eleanor was about to call for help, she heard the familiar click of dog nails on concrete. Jake trotted back into view, his tail wagging as if he'd done nothing wrong. But something was different. There was a piece of paper tied to his collar with what looked like twine. With shaking fingers, Eleanor untied the mysterious note. Her eyes widened as she read the words aloud. "Pipeline leak. Evacuate now before it's too late." She stared at Jake, her voice barely above a whisper. "What have you found, boy?" Eleanor's hands trembled as she fumbled with her house keys, her heart pounding against her ribs. Inside, she grabbed Jake's leather leash from its hook by the door and snatched her phone from the kitchen counter. "Come on, boy," she called, her voice tight with worry. Jake bounded to her side, seemingly unaware of the anxiety coursing through her. Outside, the morning had transformed into a picture of suburban tranquility that felt oddly discordant with her racing thoughts. Mrs. Chen was carefully watering her prized hydrangeas across the street, and the Thompson kids zoomed past on their bikes, their cheerful bells ringing. The normalcy of it all made the warning note feel even more surreal. Eleanor spotted Officer Rivera's patrol car parked near the corner of Maple and Oak. The officer stood beside it, engaged in conversation with Pete, their regular mail carrier. Rivera's crisp blue uniform and steady presence had always been a reassuring sight in their neighborhood, but today she needed him to be more than just a friendly face. "Officer Rivera," Eleanor called out, quickening her pace. Jake trotted alongside her, his collar jingling with each step. Both Rivera and Pete turned at her approach, their casual conversation falling silent at the urgency in her voice. "Mrs. Myers," Rivera greeted her, his expression shifting to concern as he noticed her distress. "Is everything all right?" "No, I don't think so," Eleanor said, reaching into her pocket with shaking fingers. She pulled out the crumpled note and held it out. "Jake came back with this tied to his collar just minutes ago. I don't know where he found it or who put it there, but—" Rivera took the note, his dark eyes scanning the words carefully. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" he asked, his professional demeanor taking over. Eleanor explained how Jake had suddenly bolted from the garden, describing the tense minutes before his return. "I know it sounds strange," she admitted, "but Jake's never done anything like this before." Rivera studied the note again, his brow furrowed. Pete excused himself quietly, continuing his route while casting concerned glances over his shoulder. The officer's hand moved to his radio, hesitating for just a moment before making his decision. "I'm calling this in," he said firmly. "Mrs. Myers, I want you to go back home and stay there until we can assess the situation." He lifted his radio to his mouth, speaking in clear, measured tones to request emergency response teams. The first distant wail of sirens pierced the morning air as Rivera finished his call. "Better safe than sorry," he assured Eleanor, who stood watching as more sirens joined the first, growing steadily louder. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the neighborhood as Eleanor stood among her anxious neighbors, gripping Jake's leash with white knuckles. The sight of hazmat crews in their bulky white suits made everything feel surreal, like a scene from a movie rather than their peaceful suburban street. Yellow caution tape fluttered in the breeze, creating a stark boundary between the gathered residents and the pipeline inspection area. Mrs. Chen wrung her hands nervously beside Eleanor, while Tom Bradford from number 23 crossed his arms and scoffed at the proceedings. "What a waste of taxpayer money," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Eleanor noticed how his words created ripples of both agreement and disapproval through the crowd. The hazmat crew moved methodically along the exposed section of pipeline, their instruments beeping and flashing as they took readings. Their movements were careful and precise, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were rushing through their checks. Jake sat quietly at her feet, his usual energy subdued by the tense atmosphere. "All clear on initial inspection," announced one of the hazmat technicians, his voice muffled behind his protective mask. "No immediate signs of leakage detected." A collective sigh of relief swept through the crowd, and several neighbors began to drift away, already pulling out their phones to share the news. Officer Rivera stood at his post, his expression unreadable as he watched the technicians pack up their equipment. "Hold on," he called out, his authoritative voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "We need to run additional tests." He stepped forward, speaking quietly but firmly to the lead technician. "This is ridiculous," complained Mark Stevens from the house on the corner. "They said it's fine. Some of us have work to get back to." Several others nodded in agreement, but Eleanor noticed how Rivera remained unmoved by their protests. She watched as Rivera pulled out his phone, his movements deliberate and focused. "Yes, this is Officer Rivera," he spoke into the phone, turning slightly away from the crowd. "I need a team to check gas levels in the sewer system. The whole grid, not just this section." He paused, listening. "I understand the initial results are negative, but something doesn't feel right." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine at his words. She pulled Jake closer, scratching behind his ears as she whispered, "What's really going on?" The early afternoon sun beat down on the gathered emergency crews as they methodically removed heavy manhole covers across the neighborhood. Their equipment, sleek and modern, created a stark contrast against the aged concrete of the suburban streets. Eleanor watched from her front yard as technicians lowered sensors into the dark depths below, their movements deliberate and practiced. Officer Rivera stood before a cluster of concerned residents, his usually crisp uniform showing signs of wear after hours on duty. "We're checking every access point," he explained, his voice steady and reassuring. "The gas company is bringing in their most sensitive detection equipment. Better to be thorough than sorry." Mrs. Chen from across the street clutched her cardigan tight despite the warm afternoon. "But what about our homes? Are we safe?" Her question echoed the worry visible on many faces in the crowd. As the hours crept by, the mood shifted dramatically when one of the technicians called Rivera over, pointing at readings on their equipment. Eleanor observed their serious expressions from her position near her mailbox, while Jake sat alertly at her feet. The whispers started almost immediately, spreading through the gathered neighbors like ripples in a pond. Rivera gathered everyone together, his expression grave. "We've detected trace amounts of gas in the sewer system," he announced, maintaining his professional demeanor. "While the levels are currently low, we need everyone to take precautions. No open flames, no lighting grills, and please keep your windows open for ventilation." The skeptical murmurs that had dominated the morning conversations gave way to genuine concern. Tom Bradford, who had been vocal about the waste of resources earlier, now stood quietly, his earlier bravado replaced with visible worry. Eleanor felt her journalistic instincts stirring as she processed this development. The mysterious note had been right. There was a leak, but how had someone known? She watched the emergency crews working with their equipment, her mind racing with questions. The timing seemed too perfect, too precise. Back in her living room, Eleanor sank into her favorite armchair, the events of the day weighing heavily on her mind. Jake padded over and placed his head on her lap, his warm brown eyes looking up at her innocently. She ran her fingers through his soft fur, considering the role he'd played in this unfolding drama. "What did you get us into, boy?" she whispered, scratching behind his ears. Jake's tail thumped against the floor, completely unaware of the mystery surrounding his morning adventure. The evening cast long shadows through Eleanor's dining room windows, painting streaks of amber across her wooden table. Steam curled lazily from her cup of chamomile tea, its gentle aroma mixing with the lingering scent of her earlier garden roses. Outside, the rhythmic beeping of emergency vehicles and the occasional burst of radio chatter reminded her that this was far from a normal evening in their peaceful suburb. Jake's warm presence at her feet provided a measure of comfort as Eleanor spread out decades of neighborhood newsletters, carefully preserved newspaper clippings, and community meeting minutes across her table. The papers rustled softly as she methodically sorted through them, her former journalist's eye scanning for any mention of the pipeline or utility company issues. "There has to be something here," she murmured, adjusting her reading glasses. The wall clock ticked steadily, marking time as she discovered a yellowed article from 2015 mentioning a minor gas leak that had been quickly repaired. Another newsletter from 2018 briefly noted scheduled maintenance on the pipeline, but nothing suggested ongoing problems. Jake's tail thumped against the hardwood floor as he shifted position, occasionally lifting his head to watch Eleanor with those intelligent brown eyes. She reached down to scratch behind his ears, remembering how this morning had started so ordinarily in her garden. Now, here she sat, surrounded by papers, trying to understand who could have known about the leak and why they chose such a mysterious way to warn everyone. The distant sound of generators hummed through her partially open windows as emergency crews continued their work under bright floodlights. Eleanor's tea grew cold, forgotten as she immersed herself in her research. Her reporter's instincts, dormant since retirement but never truly gone, sparked to life with each document she examined. A community bulletin from 3 years ago mentioned residents complaining about strange odors. But the utility company had dismissed their concerns as normal maintenance operations. Eleanor's fingers traced the printed words, her brow furrowing as she considered the implications. Jake nudged her leg gently, perhaps sensing her growing unease. The stack of papers seemed to mock her efforts, offering tantalizing hints but no clear answers. Each dead end only intensified her determination to understand the truth behind today's events. As she sorted through the last folder, finding nothing more substantial than routine announcements and maintenance schedules, Eleanor let out a frustrated sigh. Looking down at Jake's trusting face, she shook her head. "We'll need more than this, boy. Tomorrow, it's time for some real digging." The morning sun painted golden streaks across Eleanor's kitchen as she packed her worn leather messenger bag with supplies. The familiar weight of her reporter's notebook and favorite ballpoint pens brought back memories of countless investigations from her journalism days. Jake watched her intently from his spot near the back door, his tail wagging whenever she glanced his way. "Ready for a different kind of adventure today, boy?" Eleanor smiled, tucking a small bag of his favorite treats into her pocket. The morning air carried a hint of autumn crispness as they set out, their footsteps echoing on the quiet sidewalk. Emergency vehicles still dotted the neighborhood, their presence a stark reminder of yesterday's events. The local library stood proud against the morning sky, its red brick facade warm and welcoming. Ms. Patterson, the head librarian, greeted them at the entrance with a knowing smile. "Eleanor, and Jake too," she said, bending down to scratch behind Jake's ears. "Don't worry about him. He's always welcome here." Eleanor settled at a corner table in the reference section, surrounded by towers of archived newspapers and dusty binders of public records. Jake curled up contentedly beneath her chair as she began her methodical search through decades of local history. The familiar scent of old paper and ink brought her investigative instincts rushing back. Hour after hour, she pieced together a troubling narrative. A 1998 article detailed budget cuts in pipeline maintenance. Another from 2005 mentioned a whistleblower who suddenly withdrew their complaints. She found settlement notices buried in legal notices, each carefully worded to reveal nothing while hiding everything. Her notebook filled with dates, names, and connections. The utility company's pattern became clear. Routine inspection shortened, maintenance schedules stretched thin, safety concerns dismissed. Eleanor's hand moved swiftly across the pages, documenting each discovery with practiced precision. Jake occasionally nudged her leg, reminding her to take breaks. During these moments, she shared quiet smiles with the library staff, who seemed amused by the unusual sight of a dog in their domain. But mostly, Eleanor remained absorbed in her work, her concentration broken only by the soft rustling of pages and Jake's contented sighs. By early afternoon, the evidence painted a disturbing picture. Eleanor's timeline showed years of systematic neglect masked by corporate bureaucracy. She traced her finger along a particularly damning series of maintenance deferrals, her expression growing more serious with each connection she made. Looking down at her notes one final time, Eleanor closed the dusty binder before her. "This isn't just an accident," she muttered, gathering her materials. With determination set in her features, she stood to leave, Jake faithfully rising beside her. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neighborhood as Eleanor spotted Officer Rivera's patrol car parked near the ongoing pipeline inspection site. Her leather messenger bag felt heavy with the weight of her research findings, and Jake padded faithfully beside her as they approached. Rivera stood talking with a utility worker in a neon yellow vest, their conversation hushed but intense. Eleanor's heart raced as she drew closer, clutching her notebook filled with carefully documented evidence. The utility worker glanced her way, his expression guarded as he continued adjusting gauges on his equipment. Jake's presence seemed to ease the tension slightly, his tail wagging as Rivera greeted them with a warm but concerned smile. "Officer Rivera," Eleanor called out, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I need to share something important with you." She pulled out her notebook, its pages marked with colored tabs and annotations. Rivera excused himself from the utility worker and moved a few steps away with Eleanor. The autumn breeze rustled through nearby trees as she began explaining her findings. "I've been doing some research," she said, flipping through her notes. "This company has a pattern of negligence going back years. Look at these reports from 2018, 3 separate incidents of unreported leaks, all quietly settled out of court." Eleanor's voice grew more passionate as she detailed her discoveries. There were whistleblowers, too, but they were silenced. Maintenance records show corners being cut, inspections rushed or skipped entirely. She pointed to specific dates and incidents in her notebook, her reporter's instincts on full display. Rivera listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. The utility worker in the background continued his work, but Eleanor noticed him glancing their way more frequently. Jake sat patiently at their feet, occasionally nudging Eleanor's hand for attention. "Eleanor," Rivera said finally, his voice low and measured, "this is good work, thorough work. But we need concrete evidence, something solid we can take to the authorities. Making accusations without proof could backfire, maybe even put you at risk." Eleanor's determination didn't waver. "But someone needs to expose this," she insisted. "That note Jake found, it wasn't random. Someone knows what's really happening here." Rivera placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his eyes reflecting both concern and understanding. "Just don't put yourself in danger, Eleanor. Let me handle this." Eleanor nodded, but inside she knew she couldn't step back now. Jake pressed against her leg, as if sensing her resolve, while Rivera watched them both with worried eyes. The evening air held a crisp autumn chill as Eleanor and Jake set out for their usual walk. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across well-maintained lawns. Eleanor pulled her light jacket closer, grateful for its warmth. Jake trotted beside her, his leash loose in her hand, as they maintained their familiar rhythm. The events of the day weighed heavily on Eleanor's mind. Her conversation with Rivera had left her both frustrated and more determined than ever. Houses along their route glowed with warm light from within, but fewer neighbors than usual were outside. The recent gas leak warning had created an unusual stillness in the typically bustling neighborhood. "At least you're still up for adventure, aren't you, boy?" Eleanor whispered to Jake, who responded with a quick tail wag. They rounded the corner onto Maple Street, where Eleanor noticed a white utility van parked beneath a sprawling oak tree. The vehicle's presence wouldn't normally have caught her attention, but Jake suddenly stiffened, his ears perking forward. Without warning, Jake pulled firmly on the leash, directing them toward the van. Eleanor stumbled slightly before regaining her balance. "Easy there," she murmured, but her own curiosity piqued as they drew closer. Through the van's side window, she could make out a figure hunched over the steering wheel, scribbling intently in what appeared to be a notebook. The interior light illuminated the driver's face enough for Eleanor to notice his frequent, nervous glances at his surroundings. His movements were jerky and uncertain, like someone who knew they shouldn't be there. Eleanor's journalist instincts kicked in, and she slowed her pace, trying to appear casual while observing every detail. The moment the driver spotted her watching, his entire demeanor changed. He dropped his notebook, fumbled with his keys, and started the engine with a roar that seemed too loud for the quiet evening. The van's tires squealed slightly as he pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the acrid smell of burning rubber. Eleanor quickly pulled out her own small notepad from her jacket pocket, her hand steady as she wrote down the license plate number and detailed description of the company logo emblazoned on the van's side. The blue and white emblem showed a stylized pipeline forming the letters UC, Utility Core, she assumed. Jake watched the van disappear around the corner, his tail now still and his posture alert. Eleanor scratched behind his ears, grateful once again for his instincts. "Good boy," she whispered, carefully tucking her notepad away. "Very good boy." The morning sunlight streamed through Eleanor's kitchen window, casting warm patterns on her worn wooden table. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, savoring its warmth and familiar aroma. Jake dozed nearby, his chest rising and falling peacefully. The quiet moment shattered when 3 sharp knocks echoed through the house, causing Jake to jump to attention with a soft bark. Eleanor opened her front door to find Officer Rivera on her doorstep, his usually friendly face etched with concern. His police radio crackled with constant chatter, breaking the morning silence. "Eleanor, we've got trouble," Rivera said, his voice tight. "The gas readings came back much higher than we initially thought. The whole neighborhood needs to evacuate immediately. Emergency crews are already setting up a command center down the street." Eleanor's stomach dropped, but years of journalism had taught her to stay composed in crisis. "How long do we have?" "Pack what you need for a few days. We're asking everyone to be out within 2 hours." The peaceful neighborhood transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Sirens wailed in the distance as more emergency vehicles arrived. Cars lined the streets, trunks open as families hurriedly loaded their belongings. The sound of slamming doors and worried voices filled the air. Eleanor spotted Mrs. Chen from across the street struggling with her suitcase, her husband Robert leaning heavily on his cane beside her. Without hesitation, Eleanor crossed over to help. "Let me get that for you," she said, taking the heavy bag. "Do you have somewhere to go?" "Our daughter's place," Mrs. Chen replied, her voice shaking. "But we're not sure how to get all our things there." "I'll help you pack the car," Eleanor assured them, guiding Robert to sit on their porch swing while she and Mrs. Chen worked. As she helped the elderly couple, Eleanor noticed movement at the corner of her eye. The white utility van from the previous night sat idling at the edge of the street, its driver watching the evacuation through the windshield. Even from this distance, Eleanor could see him taking notes, just as he had the night before. The morning air filled with the sounds of car engines starting and children crying. Parents tried to calm their kids while balancing armfuls of hastily packed belongings. Emergency workers in bright vests moved door to door, checking homes and helping residents. Rivera coordinated with his fellow officers, directing traffic and maintaining order in the growing chaos. Eleanor's gaze kept returning to the utility van, her reporter's instincts firing on all cylinders. The driver's furtive behavior seemed out of place, even in this chaos. As she watched, he suddenly started his engine and pulled away from the curb, disappearing around the corner without ever stepping out to help. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Eleanor's living room as she paced back and forth, phone pressed to her ear. Jake watched from his favorite spot by the window, his head tilted curiously at his owner's nervous energy. "Susan, it's Eleanor Myers," she said, her voice brightening at hearing her old friend's voice. "I need your help with something important." For the next 20 minutes, Eleanor detailed everything: the mysterious note, the gas leak, the utility company's suspicious behavior, and the van she'd spotted. Susan listened intently, occasionally interrupting with sharp, focused questions that reminded Eleanor of their days working together in the newsroom. "I've got access to our digital archives," Susan said. "Give me an hour." True to her word, Susan called back with information that made Eleanor's heart race. "There's a former employee named Harold Matthews. He tried to blow the whistle 3 years ago about maintenance issues and cost-cutting measures. The company buried it all in legal paperwork." Through Susan's connections, they arranged to meet Harold at Riverside Park the next day. Eleanor arrived early, settling on a bench far from the playground where families gathered. Jake sat at her feet, alert as always. Harold approached cautiously, a thin man in his 50s with graying hair and tired eyes. He kept looking over his shoulder as he sat down, maintaining distance between them. "I shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But Susan said you found evidence of another leak." Eleanor nodded, sharing what she'd discovered in her research. With each detail, Harold's shoulders tensed further. "They knew," he said finally, running a hand through his hair. "I reported 6 different safety violations in my district alone. Corroded pipes, faulty pressure gauges, skipped inspections. They said they'd fix it, but instead, they buried the reports and transferred me to a desk job." His words tumbled out faster now, years of pent-up frustration breaking free. "When I threatened to go public, their lawyers showed up at my door. Made it clear what would happen to my pension, my reputation." He paused, glancing around again. "They're good at making problems disappear, Ms. Myers. Very good." Eleanor leaned forward, her reporter's instincts firing. "But you kept records?" Harold nodded slowly. "Some. Enough to show a pattern if anyone was brave enough to look deeper." He stood up suddenly, checking his watch. "But that's all I can say. You're poking a hornet's nest. Be careful." Eleanor watched him hurry away, his warning hanging in the air. Jake pressed against her leg, offering silent comfort as she processed everything she'd learned. The morning sun filtered through the cafe's large windows as Eleanor arrived early, choosing a corner booth away from other patrons. Jake settled under the table, his presence reassuring as always. She ordered 2 coffees, watching the door intently until Harold shuffled in, clutching a worn leather briefcase to his chest. "I almost didn't come," Harold said quietly, sliding into the booth. His fingers drummed nervously on the briefcase. "But people need to know the truth." Eleanor pushed a coffee toward him. "Thank you for trusting me with this, Harold." With shaking hands, Harold opened his briefcase and carefully laid out document after document on the table. Maintenance records spanning 5 years showed repeated warnings about pipeline deterioration. Internal memos revealed executives dismissing safety concerns in favor of profit margins. Email chains documented systematic efforts to silence worried employees. "Look at this one," Harold said, pointing to a memo dated just 3 months ago. "They knew about potential leaks in several neighborhoods, including yours. Instead of fixing the problems, they just—" His voice cracked. "They just hoped nothing would happen." Eleanor's journalist instincts kicked into high gear as she methodically photographed each document with her phone. The evidence was overwhelming. Budget cuts in maintenance departments, delayed inspections, ignored safety protocols. One email thread particularly caught her attention. Executives joking about creative accounting to hide repair costs from shareholders. "These maintenance records," Eleanor said, holding up a spreadsheet, show they were warned about pipeline degradation in our area at least 6 times in the past year alone. Harold nodded, his face pale. Every time they chose the cheapest temporary fix, or sometimes no fix at all. He glanced nervously around the cafe. You don't understand how far they'll go to keep this quiet. I've already had strange cars parked outside my house. Mysterious phone calls. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed his trembling hand. You're doing the right thing, Harold. This isn't just about one neighborhood anymore. It's about preventing disasters waiting to happen. As she organized the documents into neat piles, the weight of the situation settled heavily on her shoulders. The current gas leak wasn't an isolated incident or an unfortunate accident. It was the result of years of deliberate negligence. Eleanor closed the folder, her hands trembling slightly. She whispered, "They knew this could happen," and resolved to confront Rivera with what she'd learned. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty driveways as emergency crews intensified their efforts. The whine of sirens mixed with megaphone announcements, creating an unsettling atmosphere. Officer Rivera moved purposefully from house to house, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by urgent professionalism. "Eleanor, you need to leave now," Rivera said, stopping at her door. "The gas levels are getting dangerous. We can't take any chances." Eleanor nodded, clutching a hastily packed duffel bag. Jake sat obediently at her feet, his tail low, sensing the tension in the air. She'd packed essentials: clothes, medications, Jake's food, and her research materials. But something held her back from getting into her car. "Just give me a few minutes to double-check everything," she told Rivera, who frowned, but moved on to the next house. The evacuation transformed the usually lively neighborhood into a ghost town. Cars filled with worried families drove away, leaving behind empty driveways and darkened windows. The silence felt heavy, broken only by distant sirens and the occasional slam of a car door. Standing on her front porch, Eleanor watched as Mrs. Peterson from across the street struggled with her cat carrier, her hands shaking as she locked her front door. The afternoon light caught the tears on her neighbor's face as she drove away, leaving another empty house behind. That's when Eleanor noticed it, the utility van she'd seen before, parked halfway down the block. Through the growing dusk, she could make out its dented fender and faded logo. The driver emerged, looking around furtively, before heading toward the alley between 2 houses. He carried something that looked like a thick manila envelope. Eleanor's heart raced. After everything she'd learned from Harold, this couldn't be coincidence. She grabbed Jake's leash tightly and moved quietly down her front steps. Years of investigative journalism had taught her how to observe without being noticed. Keeping to the shadows of the evacuated houses, Eleanor followed at a safe distance. Jake, unusually quiet, padded alongside her. The driver's footsteps echoed in the empty street as he disappeared into the alley, constantly glancing over his shoulder. Eleanor pressed herself against a garage wall, holding Jake close. The driver hadn't noticed them yet. From her position, she could see him clearly in the alley, but remained hidden enough to avoid detection. Her hands trembled slightly on Jake's leash, but her determination remained steady. The empty neighborhood seemed to hold its breath in the darkness. Eleanor sat in her favorite armchair by the window, a cold cup of tea forgotten on the side table. The streetlights cast pools of yellow light on empty driveways and abandoned gardens. Jake rested at her feet, occasionally lifting his head at distant sounds, his warm presence keeping her grounded. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward midnight. Eleanor's notebook lay open on her lap, filled with hastily scribbled notes from her conversation with Harold. The weight of his warnings pressed heavily on her mind as she gazed out at the deserted street. Suddenly, a deep rumble shook the house. Picture frames rattled on the walls, and Jake jumped to his feet, letting out a concerned whine. Through her window, Eleanor watched as an orange glow lit up the eastern sky, followed by a massive fireball that illuminated the clouds like an artificial sunrise. Her hands trembling, Eleanor turned on the television. Breaking news banners flashed across the screen as reporters described a catastrophic explosion at a pipeline junction several miles away. The camera footage showed emergency vehicles converging on a scene of devastation. Twisted metal, flames reaching into the night sky, and thick black smoke billowing upward. Authorities confirm the explosion occurred along the same pipeline system currently under investigation in the Cedar Grove neighborhood, the reporter announced gravely. Residents within a 5-mile radius are being evacuated immediately. Eleanor's phone rang, Rivera's name lighting up the screen. "Eleanor, I know you're still there." His voice was tight with worry. That explosion wasn't a coincidence. The whole system could be compromised. You need to get out now. She watched Jake pace anxiously near the door, his tail low. "Carlos, what Harold told me. He was right. They knew this could happen. They've known for years." "I understand you want justice," Rivera replied, "but you can't help anyone if you're not safe. Please, Eleanor, leave now." The television continued to broadcast footage of the explosion. Emergency workers in reflective gear moved through the chaos, their flashlights cutting through the smoke. Eleanor's throat tightened as she realized how close they'd all come to disaster. Standing at her window, Eleanor watched an emergency vehicle cruise slowly down her street, its lights casting eerie shadows. She clutched her notebook tighter and whispered, "Not yet," before sitting down to make a list of her next steps. Morning sunlight streamed through Eleanor's kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the documents spread before her. She'd been up since dawn, methodically arranging Harold's papers, her own hastily scribbled notes, and detailed pipeline maps across the worn oak table. Jake lounged nearby, his chin resting on his paws, occasionally lifting his head to watch her with concerned brown eyes. "Look at this, Jake," Eleanor murmured, sliding one document next to another. Her fingers traced the pipeline routes marked in faded blue ink. The smell of coffee grew cold in her forgotten mug as she immersed herself in the evidence. Her kitchen, usually a place of comfort and warm memories, had transformed into an investigative workspace. Papers rustled as she sorted through maintenance logs, internal memos, and email printouts. Her journalist's instincts, dormant since retirement, sparked to life with each new connection she made. A particular memo caught her eye, dated just 6 months ago. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read it carefully. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. Repairs had been intentionally delayed on multiple pipeline sections, including the junction that had exploded last night. Her neighborhood appeared on a list labeled low-priority maintenance zones. "They knew," she whispered, her voice tight with anger. Jake's ears perked up at her tone. "They knew about these risks for months, maybe years." The evidence painted a damning picture. Budget sheets showed millions diverted from maintenance funds to shareholder dividends. Email chains revealed executives dismissing safety concerns from field technicians. One spreadsheet particularly caught her attention. It calculated the cost savings of delayed repairs against potential legal settlements. Eleanor's throat tightened as she realized the full scope of what she was seeing. This wasn't simple negligence or oversight. The company had made deliberate choices, weighing human safety against profit margins. The explosion that had rocked their community last night wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of corporate greed. Jake patted over and pressed against her leg, sensing her distress. Eleanor absently scratched behind his ears while staring at the damning pile of evidence before her. Her kitchen table told a story of systematic neglect, of warnings ignored, of profits prioritized over people's lives. "They can't get away with this," she said firmly, gathering the documents into a careful stack. The morning light caught the determination in her eyes as she looked at the evidence of corporate negligence spread before her. Eleanor's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she navigated through the morning traffic. The manila envelope stuffed with Harold's documents sat heavy on the passenger seat where Jake usually rode. She'd left him at home today. This meeting with Susan needed her full concentration. The familiar sight of the Chronicle building brought back memories of her reporting days. Its red brick facade and revolving doors hadn't changed, though the newspaper's logo looked more weathered than she remembered. Her heart quickened as she parked, knowing that behind those walls she'd soon set something big in motion. "Eleanor," Susan's warm voice greeted her as she stepped off the elevator. Her former colleague, now senior editor, hadn't changed much. Same quick smile and sharp eyes that could spot a story a mile away. They hugged briefly before Susan led her to a quiet conference room. "I brought everything," Eleanor said, spreading the documents across the table. Internal memos, maintenance records, email chains, all showing they knew about these risks. Susan's professional demeanor shifted as she examined the evidence. Her eyes widened at the maintenance logs showing deliberate delays, and her jaw tightened at the memo listing Eleanor's neighborhood as low priority. "This is bigger than I expected," Susan admitted, shuffling through budget sheets showing diverted maintenance funds. "The explosion last night is all connected?" Eleanor nodded, pulling out the pipeline maps. "Same system, same pattern of neglect. They gambled with people's lives to save money." They spent hours crafting the story, Susan's fingers flying across her keyboard as Eleanor detailed everything. Harold's whistleblower account, the mysterious warning note Jake had found, the utility company's history of cover-ups, and the devastating explosion that proved their negligence. "We'll run this tomorrow," Susan declared, her voice firm. "Front page. I'm also sending it to my contacts at major networks. This needs national attention." Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders. After days of carrying this burden alone, knowing the truth would finally come out felt like taking a deep breath after being underwater. As she gathered her things to leave, her phone buzzed repeatedly. News alerts, social media notifications, and messages started pouring in. Susan had already published the story online. Among the notifications, Rivera's text stood out. "You just started a firestorm." Eleanor's phone buzzed incessantly as sunlight streamed through her bedroom window. She reached for it, her hand trembling slightly as she scrolled through dozens of notifications. Some messages made her smile. "Thank you for speaking up," and "We're behind you." Others sent chills down her spine. "You'll regret this," and "Watch your back, old lady." Jake sensed her unease and pressed his wet nose against her hand. She scratched behind his ears, drawing comfort from his steady presence. The morning paper lay on her doorstep, featuring their story on the front page. Utility company's negligence. Exposed. Former employee reveals years of cover-ups. As she sipped her morning coffee, a courier arrived with a thick envelope. Inside, formal letterhead bore the utility company's logo and legal threats demanding she retract her statements. The words blurred together. Cease and desist. Legal action. Defamation. Eleanor's hands shook, but her resolve remained firm. Her phone rang, Susan calling with updates. "They're trying to bury us," Susan said, "but we've got more sources coming forward. Other neighborhoods, other incidents. You broke this wide open, Eleanor." A knock at the door made Eleanor jump. Officer Rivera stood outside, concern etched on his face. "Just checking in," he said, stepping inside. "I'll increase patrols around your house. We take threats seriously." Throughout the day, neighbors stopped by. Mrs. Chen, from 2 doors down, brought homemade dumplings and shared how her basement had flooded last year from a broken pipe. The company had dismissed her complaints. The Hendersons across the street recalled smelling gas months ago, but being told they were imagining things. The utility company's statement appeared on local news. "These baseless allegations from a retired individual seeking attention have no merit. Our safety record speaks for itself." Eleanor watched their spokesman, noting how his rehearsed smile never reached his eyes. More messages poured in. A group of college students offered to start a social media campaign supporting her. Former utility workers reached out, wanting to share their stories. The local environmental group requested an interview. Jake stayed close all day, his protective instincts on high alert. When another courier arrived with more legal papers, he growled softly, something he rarely did. Eleanor patted his head reassuringly, though her own heart raced as she added the papers to her growing pile of threats and warnings. At her desk that evening, Eleanor read through messages from neighbors she'd known for years. "You gave us a voice," one wrote. "Finally, someone stood up to them," said another. Jake rested his head on her lap, his warm presence a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. Looking at her faithful companion, Eleanor's voice was steady despite her exhaustion. "They can try to scare me, but we're not giving up." Jake's tail wagged in response, a simple gesture that somehow made her feel stronger. The morning sun cast long shadows across Eleanor's living room as she sat transfixed by the news broadcast. The anchorwoman's voice filled the room. In a dramatic development, the State Utility Commission has launched a full investigation into Greater Valley Utilities following allegations of systemic negligence and cover-ups. Eleanor's hands trembled as she turned up the volume. Jake pressed against her leg, his warm presence steadying her nerves. The screen showed officials in suits stepping out of government vehicles, their faces stern and determined. "The commission takes these allegations extremely seriously," a gray-haired commissioner stated. "The evidence presented warrants immediate and thorough investigation." By mid-morning, the quiet neighborhood transformed into a hub of activity. State investigators in crisp suits walked the streets, clipboards in hand. They examined utility access points and took countless photographs. The sight of official vehicles lining the street gave Eleanor a surge of hope. Officer Rivera's patrol car pulled up outside her house. "They want to talk to you," he said softly, giving her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, I'll be right there with you." As Eleanor described her findings to 2 investigators in her living room, her phone buzzed. Harold's message made her heart leap. 3 more former employees just came forward. They have documentation going back 5 years. You started something big, Eleanor. The lead investigator, a woman named Martinez, listened intently as Eleanor walked her through the documents. "Mr. Harold's testimony aligns perfectly with what these other whistleblowers are saying," Martinez noted, her pen moving quickly across her notepad. Throughout the day, neighbors stopped by to share their stories with the investigators. Tales of ignored complaints, mysterious odors, and brushed-off concerns poured in. Rivera stayed close, managing the flow of people and ensuring Eleanor didn't feel overwhelmed. "You did the right thing," Rivera told her during a quiet moment. "Sometimes it just takes one person brave enough to speak up." As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor watched from her porch as the investigators methodically documented everything. They photographed the pipeline junction points, tested soil samples, and interviewed utility workers. The thorough approach gave her hope that the truth would finally come to light. One of the investigators approached her porch, his expression serious but kind. "This is just the beginning," he said simply, closing his notebook. Eleanor looked down at Jake, who sat faithfully by her side. "We've started something big, haven't we?" The morning sun streamed through Eleanor's kitchen window as her phone rang. Jake's tail thumped against the floor as she answered Susan's call. "Eleanor!" Susan's voice bubbled with excitement. "Turn on your TV right now. They're admitting it." Eleanor fumbled with the remote, and her small television flickered to life. The utility company's CEO stood at a podium, his usual confidence replaced by a look of grim resignation. "Following the state investigation, Greater Valley Utilities acknowledges significant lapses in our maintenance protocols," he announced. "We are implementing immediate reforms, including full pipeline replacement in affected areas and new safety measures across our entire network." Eleanor sank into her chair, tears welling in her eyes. Jake padded over and rested his head on her lap, sensing her emotion. Her phone buzzed continuously, with messages of support from neighbors and community members. Later that evening, Eleanor walked into the crowded community center for the town hall meeting. The room hummed with tension as utility company representatives sat at a long table, facing rows of concerned citizens. State officials flanked them, their expressions stern. When Eleanor's turn to speak came, she rose slowly, her heart pounding. The room fell silent. "A week ago, our neighborhood was evacuated because of a gas leak that could have been prevented," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But this isn't just about one leak or one neighborhood. It's about corporate responsibility and public safety. It's about choosing people over profits." She shared her journey, from finding the mysterious note to uncovering years of negligence. As she spoke, heads nodded in agreement. Even the utility company representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "We can't just accept promises," Eleanor continued. "We need to stay vigilant. We need to hold them accountable, not just today, but every day moving forward." The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous standing ovation. People Eleanor had known for years looked at her with new respect and gratitude. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Mrs. Rodriguez, her elderly neighbor, stood up and declared, "Eleanor spoke for all of us. She's our hero." The utility company representatives attempted to redirect the conversation to their new safety protocols, but the community's attention remained fixed on Eleanor's message of accountability and vigilance. Each time they tried to minimize their responsibility, someone from the crowd would stand and demand real answers. As the meeting concluded, residents gathered around Eleanor, sharing their own stories and thanking her for giving them a voice. Rivera appeared at her side, a proud smile on his face. "You've made a real difference, Eleanor," he said quietly. The morning sun cast long shadows across Eleanor's front yard as moving trucks rumbled down the street. She sat on her porch swing, Jake lounging at her feet, watching families return to their homes after weeks of evacuation. The scent of her blooming roses mingled with the fresh paint some neighbors were already applying to their houses. "Welcome back," Eleanor called out to the Martinez family across the street. Their young daughter, Sarah, waved enthusiastically before racing to hug her friend from 2 doors down. The sound of children's laughter filled the air, a welcome change from the recent weeks of eerie silence. Eleanor pulled out her notebook, jotting down ideas for the community meeting she'd planned for that evening. The local church had offered their basement, and Officer Rivera had helped spread the word to returning residents. Her phone buzzed with messages from neighbors confirming their attendance. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor walked through the neighborhood, posting flyers about the meeting on lampposts. She stopped to chat with Mrs. Chen, who was organizing her garden tools, and Mr. Patterson, who was checking his mail for the first time in weeks. Each conversation reinforced her belief that the community needed to come together now more than ever. At the church basement that evening, Eleanor was surprised to see nearly 50 people had shown up. Folding chairs scraped against the floor as neighbors settled in, many bringing homemade cookies and coffee to share. Rivera stood near the door, offering reassuring smiles to nervous residents. "We've been through something extraordinary together," Eleanor began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But we're stronger for it. Tonight, let's talk about how we can support each other moving forward." Ideas flowed freely. Sarah's mother suggested creating a phone tree for emergencies. Mr. Patterson, a retired security guard, volunteered to coordinate a neighborhood watch program. Mrs. Chen offered to teach a workshop on emergency preparedness. The energy in the room was infectious. People who had barely spoken before were exchanging phone numbers and making plans. Eleanor watched as natural leaders emerged, taking charge of different initiatives. Rivera stepped forward to offer police department resources and training for the neighborhood watch. As Eleanor stood at her living room window that evening, the street looked different somehow. Porch lights glowed warmly, and she could see neighbors chatting in their driveways, reluctant to end their conversations. Jake pressed against her leg, his tail wagging contentedly. "It feels like home again, doesn't it?" she whispered to him, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over her. The late afternoon sun streamed through Eleanor's kitchen window as she sat at her computer, sipping tea with Jake dozing nearby. Her inbox notification chimed, and she opened an email from Sarah Martinez, not the young girl from across the street, but a recent journalism graduate who had been following Eleanor's pipeline investigation story. "Dear Mrs. Myers," the email began, "your courage in exposing the utility company's negligence has inspired me deeply. As a young journalist just starting my career, I wonder if you would consider mentoring me. Your dedication to truth and justice represents everything I hope to achieve in my work." Eleanor's fingers hovered over the keyboard as memories of her own early career flooded back. She remembered the excitement of her first big story, the nervousness before confronting powerful figures, and the mentors who had guided her along the way. Bill had always encouraged her to share her knowledge with others, saying her experience was too valuable to keep to herself. After careful consideration, Eleanor replied with an invitation to meet at the local cafe the following afternoon. As she clicked send, a mixture of excitement and apprehension filled her chest. It had been years since she'd formally mentored anyone. The next day, Eleanor sat at a corner table, watching Sarah enter the cafe. The young woman's eager expression reminded Eleanor of herself 30 years ago. They ordered coffee, and Eleanor listened as Sarah shared her dreams of investigative journalism and making a difference in the world. "The pipeline story showed me that one person really can create change," Sarah said, her eyes bright with determination. "I want to learn how to do that, how to find the truth and make it matter." Eleanor found herself sharing stories from her career, the victories, the setbacks, and the lessons learned along the way. She explained how maintaining integrity was crucial, even when facing pressure to back down. The recent pipeline investigation had reinforced these principles more than ever. "Sometimes the hardest part isn't finding the truth," Eleanor explained, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "It's having the courage to stand by it when people try to silence you. But that's when it matters most." As they talked, Eleanor felt a familiar spark igniting within her, the same passion for journalism that had driven her career. Sarah's questions were thoughtful and precise, showing a natural instinct for the craft that Eleanor recognized and respected. They discussed practical investigative techniques, the importance of building trusted sources, and how to verify information thoroughly. Eleanor emphasized the responsibility that came with the power of the press, sharing examples from her own experience where careful reporting had made real differences in people's lives. The conversation flowed naturally, and Eleanor found herself enjoying the role of mentor more than she'd expected. It felt right to pass on her knowledge, to help shape the next generation of journalists who would continue the vital work of uncovering truth. Sarah took detailed notes as Eleanor spoke, occasionally interjecting with insightful questions that showed she was already thinking like an investigative reporter. Her enthusiasm was infectious, reminding Eleanor of the fundamental importance of their profession in maintaining a just society. As their meeting drew to a close, Sarah gathered her notes and looked at Eleanor with sincere gratitude. "You've inspired me more than you know," she said warmly. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Eleanor's driveway as she retrieved her mail, Jake trotting faithfully beside her. Among the usual bills and advertisements, a cream-colored envelope caught her eye. The official seal of the city gleamed in the corner, and her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was an elegantly printed invitation to the annual Community Excellence Award ceremony. The mayor's office wanted to honor her for her role in exposing the utility company's negligence and protecting the neighborhood. Eleanor's first instinct was to decline. She had never sought recognition for doing what she felt was right. "You deserve this," Rivera told her later that day, when he stopped by to check on her. "The community wants to thank you properly." His genuine smile and encouraging words made her reconsider her initial reluctance. As the ceremony approached, neighbors dropped by with cards and small gifts, sharing stories of how her actions had inspired them. Mrs. Johnson from 2 doors down brought over a freshly baked apple pie, saying, "You gave us all courage to speak up." Even the usually quiet Mr. Peterson across the street stopped to tell her how proud the neighborhood was of her efforts. The evening of the ceremony arrived crisp and clear. Eleanor wore her favorite blue dress, the one Bill had always said brought out her eyes. Jake had to stay home, but Rivera promised to keep her company throughout the event. The community center was packed with familiar faces, all beaming with pride as she entered. Mayor Thompson's speech captured the impact of Eleanor's investigation perfectly. "Some heroes wear capes," he said, his voice carrying through the hushed room. "Others simply refuse to look the other way when they see something wrong." Mrs. Myers reminded us that one person's courage can protect an entire community. When Eleanor stepped up to accept her award, the standing ovation caught her off guard. Faces she'd known for years looked back at her with genuine appreciation. Rivera stood nearby, applauding with visible pride. The weight of the moment settled over her as she approached the podium, her prepared speech forgotten in her pocket. Instead, she spoke from her heart about community, about the strength found in standing together, and about how every person has the power to make a difference. "This award," she said, holding up the gleaming plaque, "belongs to all of us, to every neighbor who shared their story, to every person who refused to be silenced, to everyone who believed that truth matters." Her words resonated through the room, bringing tears to many eyes. She saw Susan from the newspaper, dabbing at her cheeks, and even the usually stoic Rivera looked moved. The thunderous applause that followed felt like a warm embrace from the entire community. The mayor stepped forward again, shaking Eleanor's hand firmly. "Thank you for showing us what real citizenship looks like," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The crowd continued to applaud as Eleanor made her way back to her seat, the plaque held close to her heart. The morning sun painted golden streaks across Eleanor's garden, warming her face as she settled into her favorite wrought iron chair. Jake sprawled contentedly at her feet, his tail occasionally thumping against the flagstone path. The roses she and Bill had planted together years ago created a symphony of colors, deep reds, soft pinks, and creamy whites dancing in the gentle breeze. Eleanor wrapped her hands around her steaming cup of Earl Grey tea, breathing in its familiar bergamot scent. The garden had been their special project, something they'd pour their hearts into every spring and summer. Bill would spend hours carefully pruning each bush, while Eleanor researched the best fertilizers and pest control methods. Now, the garden stood as a living testament to their shared passion. "Remember how you used to tease me about talking to the roses, Bill?" she whispered, a soft smile playing on her lips. The memory of his hearty laugh echoed in her mind. He had always said she had a way with nurturing things, plants, animals, and especially people who needed help. The past few weeks had transformed her quiet retirement into something she never expected. The investigation, the media attention, and the ceremony had pulled her far from her comfort zone. Yet somehow, it felt right. Bill had always encouraged her to stand up for what she believed in, even when it meant facing opposition. The garden, once a bittersweet reminder of her loss, now felt different. The roses seemed brighter, more alive. Each bloom represented not just memories of the past, but hope for the future. She had discovered a strength within herself that Bill had always seen, even when she doubted it existed. Jake shifted position, resting his head on her foot. Eleanor reached down to scratch behind his ears, remembering how Bill had always wanted a dog, but never got the chance. "You would have loved Jake," she said softly. "He's got that same protective spirit you had." The morning light caught the dewdrops on the rose petals, creating tiny prisms that scattered rainbow colors across the garden. Eleanor sat back, taking in the peaceful scene before her. The weight of recent events seemed to lift from her shoulders, replaced by a sense of accomplishment and peace. Looking at the vibrant roses, Eleanor smiled gently and whispered, "I think you'd be proud, Bill." The late afternoon sun filtered through Eleanor's study window, casting a warm glow on her newly arranged writing space. She'd cleared off the old oak desk that had sat unused since her retirement, carefully positioning her laptop in the center. To her right, she placed a framed photo of Bill from their last anniversary together, his kind eyes seeming to encourage her. Another photo showed Jake, tongue lolling happily, taken just days after she'd adopted him. Eleanor adjusted her reading glasses and opened a fresh document on her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before typing the words that would begin her story. It all started with a note. Jake padded into the room, settling at her feet with a contented sigh. The familiar weight of him against her legs grounded her as memories flooded back. The fear when she first read the warning, the determination that drove her investigation, and the overwhelming support she received from her community. As she wrote, Eleanor found herself transported back to each moment. The words flowed naturally, her journalist's instinct for storytelling taking over. She described the quiet mornings in her garden that preceded the chaos, the tense town hall meetings, and the victory that belonged not just to her, but to everyone who stood beside her. Eleanor reflected on the journey that transformed her quiet street into a symbol of unity and resilience. Inspired by neighbors who stood together through adversity, she typed a dedication. "To my neighbors who showed me that community is our greatest strength. To those who stood beside me when standing alone seemed impossible. And to everyone who believes that one voice can make a difference." Her dog, Jake, stirred by her feet as sunlight painted her desk in gold. Outside, children rode bikes and neighbors chatted, a scene rich with meaning after their hard-fought victory. Later, at a neighborhood celebration, Eleanor was greeted with gratitude and stories of inspiration. Rivera, her steadfast ally, marveled at how far they'd come since the day she first shared the mysterious note. Amid laughter and joy, Eleanor addressed the crowd. her words celebrating the strength and courage of ordinary people uniting for justice. In the morning, Eleanor tended her garden, now a symbol of renewal. Jake's playful bark reminded her of his role in uncovering the danger that once threatened their community. The street, vibrant with activity, was a testament to their collective effort. As she prepared for mentoring sessions with aspiring journalists, Eleanor felt excited to share lessons of courage, persistence, and ethical reporting. Her journey, rooted in a single act of determination, had blossomed into a legacy of change, inspiring others to make a difference. With Jake at her side, she basked in the peace of a thriving neighborhood they helped secure. If you enjoyed the story of Eleanor, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.